Hi, this is Joe Mako, and I've got Matt Lutton with me, and we're going to take a look at this question by Ashley Flanagan on calculating user retention rate. Now, this is our first video that we've done like this, and if I talk about something that may not have good clarity in it, I welcome Matt to step in and stop me and ask me questions so that we can dive into greater detail. But this is one of these situations where inside a Tableau, it seems like this should be simple and direct, but because of the deep complexity in Tableau, this simple question can become quite complex. So overall, the question that they're looking for is they've got a list of user IDs and the dates that they log in. And they want to see, for any given date, what's the number of users that log in again within the next 2 weeks. So for some sample data that we created, we've got a list of IDs and a list of dates. And when we throw this into Tableau, I'm going to create a new workbook here and build this all from scratch. So we'll do a new workbook, or just to show it here real quick, because I've already got it. We've got the ID and date that we've got this user who logs in on the 14th, 16th, 18th. So all of those logins, that user has logged in less than 2 weeks. So they would be counted as part of that percentage of people on the 14th that logged in again within 2 weeks. So we're going to be looking forward, kind of like a lead function. And that's going to be the two-step process that we've got here. The first step is using this look forward to figure out how many days until the next login. And then the next step, we're going to look at this date and see what percentage of these IDs that logged in on this date logged in again, meeting that threshold. Okay. The final end result of what we want to see is going to be a line chart like this that gives us our percentage over time. All right. Any questions so far, Matt?
No, but it might. I think it would be helpful to restate the goal again. You're saying per date we want 1 mark for the percentage rate, right?
That's correct. So we want to end up at the level of detail of per day, that we want to say for any given day, out of the users that logged into that day, what percentage of them logged in again in the next 2 weeks. And so that's going to be the two parts of it is, first we got to figure out which users logged in again in the next 2 weeks, and then we calculate the percentage of those users on that day. Okay?
Yep. That helps.
So let's start off here with our blank workbook so we can see this from scratch. We connect to our Excel file. And we'll go to the worksheet. Now inside of here, we've got ourselves our 2 dimensions. We've got ourselves an ID, and we have a date. And so the first step is we want to figure out, for this ID and this date, how long was it until the next login? So we can use a table calculation, or what Tableau calls a table calculation, where we want to say, take the current day, or even let's do the lookup for the next day. So lookup, let's do it this way. Let's find the function over here in the table calculations and grab lookup. And this is a table calculation that has 2 arguments, an expression and an offset. So the expression is going to be our aggregation. In this case, we want to look at date. Now, because if we want to look at date, and it is a dimension out here, meaning it's setting the granularity, it's in the group by clause, wrapping it inside of an aggregation is just to meet Tableau's requirement that the expression be an aggregation. And then our offset is we want to look at the next date. So let's see what this looks like so far. If we leave it like this and pull this out here onto the text shell, that for the 14th, it looks up the next and it sees the 16th. And that makes sense for all these going down. But then when we get to this 327, it looks up the next and it comes up with this 1/1/2014. So that's not quite partitioning correctly. We want it to break and restart every time the ID changes and move along the dates. So we're going to be looking up the next date inside of each ID. And the way that we specify this inside of Tableau is we say that we want the compute using to be on date. Whatever we select for our compute using, those will be the dimensions used for addressing, and all other dimension fills will be used for partitioning. So in this case, by selecting date, we're saying address on date and partition on ID. Now when we do that, we see that something strange happened. We went from our 942 distinct combinations of ID and date up to 10,000. And that's because I've got 100 different IDs and 100 different dates. So the combination of that gives us a potentiality of 10,000 different combinations. And by using a date data type as our compute using, Tableau will automatically turn on this densification. So one of the ways to turn this off is to bring over both date and ID into the addressing side. Put ID at the top, because that's going to impact how these two drop-downs work, and we want to restart every ID. So this is telling Tableau we want to address on the combination of them, kind of a combined field, and then we want to restart our count, or restart it, to do this after partitioning, the pseudo-partitioning on ID. And this way, we do not get the data densification, and we get the partitioning the way that we want it. Is that clear so far?
Yeah, can you, is there a way for you to visually kind of show what you mean by partitioning?
So the visual way that I think about partitioning is this pane here, that if I were to say compute using pane down, that's essentially saying with inside of this pane. So each ID is its entirely separate thing. So it's basically like if I did a keep only on this, this is the bucket, this is the partition. And so if I were to change this back to be the compute using simply date, it looks great. That's exactly what we expect. The difference between these is that when we remove that filter, now Tableau is aware of all these other potential dates for all these other potential IDs, and it brings all dates to all IDs. It's essentially something that looks like this, where it created this massive grid where we've got 100 rows by 100 columns, so we get 10,000 marks. That the table calculation has caused all of these to be filled in with a mark. If we remove the table calculation, the data densification turns off. We go back to 942, and if I try to draw a rectangle around it, the only marks that are out here are those marks that really exist. Now, another way to see it is if I just drop it out here, we get all the ABCs filled in everywhere. The reason why they were blank before is because I put it on the text shelf, and if it's null, it's not going to show anything there. Okay? So the reason why we are doing this table calculation configured with an advanced is because we want to turn off the data densification while keeping this as a date data type. We could change this data type to be a string, and the densification would not turn on for us. This is just one of the many ways that we can turn this densification off, by bringing over both of them and restarting on ID. And notice that the reason why ID is listed here as the option is because inside of our advanced dialog, ID is at the top of the list, and the bottom one or the last one will not be available. If we have multiple dimensions over here in the addressing, only the last one would not be available for restarting. Okay?
Sure.
So
yep.
This gives us...
Did you say that if we made the date, if we were able to make the date a string, or I mean we are able, but if we wanted to, we could make the date into a string, and that would allow us to avoid densification completely, right?
Yep.
In this specific example. Yep.
So if I turn this into a string, and pull out this instead of date, and then simply set our compute using to be that date, there is no densification. So that's that's another route to turn it off, is either you change your data type or you change your compute using configuration.
Right. But that could also, though, potentially affect our final bit of viz that we're making in terms of what we can do visually.
Yeah, because if we have a string out here, I cannot turn this into a nice continuous axis,
right,
because it is a string. Now, one of the potential ways to work around that is I could bring it down here and then pull out our date as a minimum, and this way now it's going to be a measure, an aggregation, and now we get our nice axis on there. So that's another potential workaround, is we just have our string for the one that is using the compute using there down there, and then have this simply for display as an additional information that does not impact the table calculation or the data densification. But this also limits us from the ability to turn on like a show missing values or whatnot. So there's all sorts of trade-offs depending on which route you choose to go. For myself, I generally prefer to use the actual date data type and then just configure my compute using. Now, hopefully all this complexity that I'm going into here will become obsolete. This video will not be needed in a future version of Tableau. That hopefully we'll be able to have more direct control over when Tableau densifies or doesn't densify, instead of this automatic behavior here that makes us jump through hoops and do workarounds to get the results and interaction that we're looking for.
Right. This might be another good thing to mention. I know that today I was looking at the forums and saw some ideas related to allowing more control in terms of data densification. So in terms of a plug for people to vote on ideas, I know Jonathan's got one out there about setting the min and max of a range for domain.
And this is something that Tableau is completely aware of, that their developers do know about this and they are working on solutions. I just don't know when they're going to incorporate it. But for now, this is something to be aware of, is your dimension pills, their data type, what your compute using configuration is, will impact whether you get data densification or not. Okay?
Right. Yep.
So back to the question at hand, is we want to figure out what's the difference between these two. In this case, we want to subtract the lookup from the actual date. So we'll edit our calculation here. I'll call it days to next. And we'll take our lookup and subtract our date. Again, I have to wrap it in an aggregation to make Tableau's conditions be happy. And so the min or max or ATTR doesn't really matter here, because date is a dimension filled out here. So it's just a preference on which aggregation to choose.
Right.
So now we have our difference in the number of days here. And because I've specified this as a absolute, where I've specified exactly ID and date and restart every ID, or if I had done something directly here from the compute using selecting either date or ID, those are absolute compute usings that I can move these pills around and the computation will not change. As we can see for ID2, on January 1st, it was 22 days until the next one. When I move this around, those numbers stay the same. That's one of the benefits of the absolute compute using versus a relative. And relative compute usings being these table downs and pane downs and acrosses. Because as you move your pills around, the structure of your crosstab will change, and thus your computation will change. But with a absolute reference, as you move your pills around, the computation will tend to stay the same. Okay?
Yep. Very good.
So this gives us our step one, data. And now off of this, I want to calculate how many of these on this date meet our thresholds. Now to leave this as slightly configurable, we'll create a parameter for threshold. And we'll make it an integer and default it to 14 for 2 weeks. We'll go ahead and show that for now. And when we create our calculated field, what we want to do here is figure out how many IDs logged in on this day. That's our first question. Now, one of the easy ways that we can do that is just with a size function. Now, the size function will tell us how many records are inside of this partition. So if I were to address on ID and partition on date, kind of how this is visually set up with a pane for each date, that we'll get the number of marks within inside of that day. So drag and drop that out here. Oops. Let's put it, let's make this a continuous and pull this out there. So again, the default is table down, but if we set the compute using to be ID, we get ourselves 14. And that 14 matches the 14 records inside of that day. If we look at this, we've got 7 because there are 7 records inside of that day, 7 IDs. So that is our denominator. And our numerator is going to be that condition. So we'll edit this. I'll comment this out for just a minute because we're going to come back to it. Now,
can I make a comment real quick or ask a question real quick there, Joe, about size? Because I see a lot of forum posts and I see a lot of workbooks that people create. It's something that people do a lot of different ways, whether they know or not that size is available to them, or whether, sometimes we see window some number of records, or some variation on another table calc to get that same result.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, I guess I'm just trying to point out the benefit of realizing that some of those calcs are there to help you. In situations like that, really simplify things down.
I think it comes down to preference, that Tableau is not a single pathway tool. It's got a bunch of different varieties to it, that to get to a destination inside of Tableau, there's multiple ways to get there. And it's not that one way is right and another way is wrong, or it's what fits your mental model and what meets your goals. If you're looking for performance as your goal, then maybe one way will be better than another. If you're looking for ease of understanding, that you would want to have simple, human-readable calculations that make sense to you, and performance isn't really an issue, then of course, whatever makes sense to you is going to be better. Because it's not just one way of using Tableau. You can use Tableau to fit your own needs and fit your own mental model. So to show you an example of another way to get size or that same result is I could do a window sum. Oops, brings up from down here. I'm not a very good typist, so we just grab window sum and take the average of 1. That's going to give me 1 for each one of those, and I get the exact same result with a different calculation. Now, for me, when I look at this versus window sum of the average of 1 versus size, size is a little bit easier for me to read. So that's one that I go with. I don't know which one's going to be more performant. They would probably be pretty close in performance, unless you have really a large number of marks coming back. You may not even notice a difference at all in performance, if there is even is a difference. Okay. Okay. So
good example of we don't know everything all the time about what we're doing. Sometimes we have to study what's going on and look at the number of marks and pay attention to the status bar.
Definitely, absolutely. That's going to be something we do quite commonly. So for the top part, we want it to be this condition of, does this ID on this date meet our threshold? So to start off, I'm going to do just an if statement to say, if the days to next is less than or equal to our threshold, then give me a 1, else give me a 0, and end. So this is basically taking this result of this calculation, comparing it to our threshold parameter, and giving us a 1 or a 0 based on if it meets that condition. And now, if we look at this, it defaulted to a different compute using. If we come into here, it defaulted to table across. And this is because we had the pill out there already, or this would happen if our sub-nested table calculation wasn't there. So an easy way to resolve that is remove it, and we'll bring it out again. And now it works as expected because this is already out here. When we dragged and dropped this new one, Tableau is automatically able to configure it because each pill can be configured differently. And these are just kind of a tip to make building these complex things better, as you start at the beginning and you keep placing out the derivative calculations that reference the previous ones, leaving all the previous ones out there until the end. Okay?
Yeah, Joe, you might go back into that dialog and kind of explain that as you're selecting parts of your nested table calc that you're given some helpful descriptive text, at least, that can at least give you some guide as to what you're doing. I mean, you got the tooltip
so when we
there
look
as well.
at this has got this calculated field drop down here.
Exactly.
That when we look at this one and go into the edit table calculation dialog, we don't get that drop down because this days to next calculation is not referencing another table calculation calculated field. It's using table calculations itself, and it's referencing dimensions that it's aggregating. This one, calculation 1 right now, that we're going to rename to count for now, is referencing this table calculation calculated field. And that's why we get that drop down, is because count itself right now doesn't have any table calculations, but this other one here does. Okay?
Yep.
And so that's why we get this drop down. When we edit this, we get the days to next. Now when I add a calculation to this, when I want to do my percent, and we want to wrap this in a window sum, because we want to get the sum of all these ones here, window sum, now this percent has a table calculation, and it's referencing a table calculation. And this is what we call a nested table calculation. It's a table calculation with inside of a table calculation. And now when we look at the compute using for this, or the edit table calculation, we get two values in this dropdown, the percent and the days to next. So the days to next is already configured as we had before, with both ID and date as our addressing, restarting every ID. And for our percent, we just want to compute using on ID because we want to restart for each day. We want to partition on date, and ID is a number, so we don't need to mess with the advanced because it's fairly simple in that example. So when we click apply to that, we get a 0.64 to let us know that 64% of these met the threshold. And when we look down here, 86% of these met the threshold. Okay.
I'm kind of lagging behind you. I don't know if that's going to affect the video at all, but
I hope not. We'll see in the end. I think it records on my end locally.
Yeah, it should do. I would think so too. Okay.
All right. So from here then, we want to format that. Default properties, number format as a percentage, and we'll drop it down to no decimal places so it looks simple. So those are the numbers that we want for each individual day. And now I only want to keep just a single one of these. So I'm going to leave it here because this is all of our work and all of our numbers. If we want to come back to it again, we'll leave it there as a sheet. So I'm going to duplicate this sheet and rename this one to data. And on this one, we're going to start moving these pills around to create a visualization. The first thing we want to do, though, is get rid of all these extra marks because we only want a single mark per date. An easy way to do that is with a isFirst equals 0. So we'll call it isFirst, and first equals to 0. Now before we do that, let's take a look at what the first calculation does for us. We bring it out here. And this is telling us, what do I have to do to reach the first record in the partition? Now for this one, I haven't set the partitioning, but I'll set it to the ID now. And this is telling us that I need to go back 0 records to reach the first record because I am the first record. This one's got a -1 because it needs to go back one space or one mark to reach the first record. This one down here has to go back 13 to reach the first record. And that's because there are 14 records or 14 marks inside of this partition. So what we see as a commonality is for all of these partitions, there's always a 0. You could also replace this with a index and check to see if it's a 1, because there will always be a 1 in each one of them. Or we could also use a last equals to 0. There will always be a last record in each partition. Now we notice for this, it gives us that opposite of the numbers. It's telling us I need to move 13 forward to reach the last record, or I need to move 1 forward to reach the last record, or a 0 if it is the last record. Okay? So we're going to use it is first equals true. So first equals 0. We're at first. And we're going to remove that. And we'll pull it out here again onto the marks card and set our compute using to be ID. So when I look at it out here, we get just the first one inside of each of these partitions is going to be true. So when I put this onto the filter shelf, we get just a true, and we've got our final data. We'll go ahead.
So Joe, that it does. You're saying it does not matter. You can do last equals 0, any number of those. It doesn't matter what ID you're keeping, in essence, right?
Yeah. So the reason why we do first equals 0 is because every partition will have at least one 0. If I did first equals 10, that may not work consistently because this date here only had 7 records in it. So there is no first equals 10, or in fact, maybe like a -10.
Right.
So there is no mark inside of this partition that needs to go back -10 to reach the first. By using a 0 would work, or we could also use a last equals 0, or we could use a index equals 1. All of these are essentially equivalent for this situation. The first equals 0 and index equals 1 will return the exact same record, the exact same mark, whereas last equals 0 will return the last record inside that partition, while these two will return the first record. Okay?
And this goes back to the original goal of turning records into marks, right? We want to get down to just whatever combination number of days that we want to show in the final view.
Yep. Our end goal is to have the visualization at the date level of granularity, but in order to compute the days to next, we also need to have ID out here.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
So with this now, we've got our data, we've got our numbers. We'll go ahead and remove this one. It's no longer needed. We move ID down to the marks card so that it doesn't impact our visualization. And right now, when we hover over these tooltips, we get to see this ID there. We really don't need that. So we can say don't include in tooltip. And now we just get the date and the %, which is what we're interested in. So we'll put date up here, and we'll put % over here. And we will turn this into a bar chart. So we get this type of visualization. That this is the accurate numbers. And what we can see is that there's some days in here that we had logins, but there was nobody that logged in again in the next 14 days. If we increase this, or rather decrease it, we may see some differences. So we get the change in the visualization of the data based on our threshold. Okay?
Yep.
And from here now, this is great for being a bar, but what if I wanted to have a line? If I turn this into a continuous axis, we get this, which is not so great. So I want this as a line, and I get something incredibly wacky here. This is really strange. And what Tableau is doing here is it's trying to make line segments for each ID. So because this one is a dot, this ID that we have out there, let me include that back in the tooltip, ID 32 only ended up being the first ID in that one day, versus something like ID number 2, it was the first day over these multiple ones. So Tableau is playing connect the dots for each individual ID and connecting them left to right. We don't really want to do that. We want to connect sequentially on date. And we also need to be able to connect on ID as well, because if I were to just pull date down here to discrete and put that onto the path shelf, we get something that looks very similar again. It doesn't really help us. Or if we just put ID onto the path shelf, it's still crazy. Now what we really want to do is we want both of the dimension pills, both ID and date, on the path shelf at the same time, and we still need to be able to have this compute using that references ID separately from date. So in order to do that, we can use a combined field. Now a combined field is generally going to seem like a concatenation, but it does more. It enables Tableau to see that these are two separate fields. So when I put this onto the path shelf, I can get my mouse to work correctly. So this out there on the path shelf, it still gives me those lines connected all crazy, but if I set the sort on this to be on our date and a minimum, so that we're sorting by the actual date values, now we get our line connected sequentially correctly. So that is one of those ways to work around how Tableau works here. And there we go. We've got a 0 down here for those days that had no percentage, which is nice as well.
Okay, this was by far, for me, the most complex part of the problem, in that I'm not very familiar with the path shelf in this context. And so is the path shelf in this context purely enabling you to work around the problems that you encounter along the way?
So what the path shelf does is it lets us play connect the dots. If you've ever played those connect the dots where you get a bunch of dots on a page and they're numbered 1 through 75 or whatnot, that the path shelf is the numbering of those dots. It tells Tableau what sequence to connect these dots in. So this combination of dimension pills is giving us our granularity, and then by having it on the path shelf and sorting this pill by our date, it's now telling us that we want to connect these individual dots by their date in sequence. So irregardless of the ID, because we've got a whole bunch of different IDs on the side of each one of these. Like this one is ID 2, this one's ID 24, and that's because those were the first IDs inside of each one of these, because we're keeping just the first. So this is working around how Tableau works with these dimensions.
And again, that was only needed when you were going from the bar mark type to the line mark type in this instance for this problem?
It's needed because we want to connect the dots. We want to draw a single line that connects them. And so that's one of a few ways to connect these dots.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, I guess. Could you pull date and ID both separately, or like Control-Shift drag them both to the path shelf?
No, the path shelf will only let you put a single pill on it at a time. Things like the color shelf, they let you put multiple pills, label shelf, multiple pills, but the path shelf, you can only put a single pill on there. I believe the size, we can only put a single pill on the size as well.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that at all.
So this gives us a interesting result and useful. We get all these additional marks in there. Now, if we wanted those to disappear, we could go into the format of this date, and on the pane, we can say, I want to show either connected the lines for an interpolation, or we could potentially break the lines. Or why did it not break? Maybe it's because how I wrote my calculation. If I change my calculation here to be a then 1, so we get a null inside of there, now we break it and we get null values. So as we change our formula, we can either get things there or not. And so with it being a null, we should be able to turn on the interpolation. If I do a format and say hide connector lines, no, it doesn't do that.
Do you do that on the percent fill?
No, I think this happens.
Do it on the date.
Does it happen on the date or here? Maybe it does happen on this one. So, connect lines. You were right. So
okay,
it's on
cool.
the percent fill. So
Very good.
that is now the interpolation, but that interpolation hides the data. If we say show it default value, now we get it down there. Or we could force it to show it at the default value by putting a else 0 on there. And now we force it to be at there, irregardless of how we have this formatted. So there's different ways to turn on those zeros on or off. And we're
so what happens if you connect the lines on percent on the formatting menu there? I may be just far out in my brain here, but and remove the combined field from the path shelf. Is that going to result in some wacky view?
Well, we need to have ID as a dimension fill out here. And if we do not, if we have a dimension pill on the marks card and it's not on the path shelf, that dimension pill will cause line segmenting. As we saw, if we have ID just out here, now we get a different line for each individual ID. So it's causing distinct line segments. By putting ID and date onto the path shelf, now we can connect them in sequence.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I'm with you. I was thinking about percent being a table calc, being able to account for those dimensions, but the date on columns, of course, is not. So.
Yeah, let's see what happens if we try to do this. If I just put ID and remove that, put this just on the path shelf, and then try to sort this, but I can't really sort it because these are in there multiple times. Even if I say field date minimum, it gives us a different squiggly line, but it's not what we want. So that doesn't really help us. That's why we need to do the combined field and put both of them on the path shelf so we can say this vertex gets sorted here, and then this vertex gets sorted here. And this is that difference in how Tableau sorts. For example, if I had both date and ID out here, that this is ID sorted with inside of each date. It looks that way, but it's really ID is sorted separately from date. And we can really see this if I put let me do this. Let me put this in here and say sort this descending based on date minimum. That's sort take. Maybe I didn't click it right. So sort descending on date minimum, and OK. There we go. And so it may not give us the exact sort that we want here. That it puts 24 over there. So it's this non-nested sorting. Versus if we take this combined out here, then we can sort them independently. And that's a technique that we've seen used in Tableau before to get this more Excel-style sorting of ID and then date with this partitioning. Okay.
Yep.
So that gives us all of those different things there. Any other questions?
Well, and just in kind of reviewing what you showed, I mean, that basically you get to this by understanding all the impacts of all these different features of Tableau. I mean, understanding what a combined field does, understanding some of how at least the order of operations is carried out. All these different factors kind of combined allow you to kind of quickly and not as quick as you'd like, but quicker than most people, solve this problem with only a very simple data set. So I guess I'm just kind of confirming that it just is hours of study and practice and an understanding and connecting the dots in your knowledge that has allowed you to build a view like this.
Absolutely. It comes down to awareness, that being aware of your dimension pills versus measure pills and what it means to be a dimension or a measure, that a dimension is your granularity, your group by clause, and measure simply means aggregation or after aggregation. That blue means discrete and green means continuous, but blue and green do not tell you if it is a dimension or a measure. In this case, date up here, this is a continuous dimension pill, that it's impacting the granularity. Things of that nature are the most vital things. And if we looked at this back here, the reason why we configured this edit table calculation with both of these is because this is turning off data densification, because generally we just want date on the addressing. By having both ID and date, that turns off the densification. That enables us to get the first level calculation of taking the next date for that ID and subtracting the current date to get us our difference in days, which is step 1. And then percent is going to take the sum of this computation that checks that value of does the days to next less than or equal to the threshold. We return a 1, else a 0, and this else 0 is plotting that point down at the bottom. Or we could remove it and then use the formatting of percent to turn it on or connect the dots or whatever we want to do there. So this else 0 or not having it there gives us that option. And then the size is taking the number of IDs with inside of this date as our denominator to give us our percentage. And then our first is going to keep just that single mark per date. And then when we draw it, we're going to have our combined field to give us those individual vertexes that we sort the combination of them by the date, so we can connect them left to right as expected. And so that is complexity of Tableau to solve a seemingly simple question.
Right. Well, I know I speak for everyone in being very appreciative of your time and showing us how all these things kind of connect in your mind, kind of going through your thought process as you build something like this. I think this is so beneficial, just even as this short period of time with you. There's so many different aspects that if you can, people can watch this video, and hopefully, again, it won't be necessary in the future, but people can watch videos like this and some of the other Think Data Thursday videos, and they can start to build on their understanding. So not only that, you're taking a very simplified down data set and showing us that things are possible if we can connect the dots in our understanding.
Yep, the awareness and mindfulness of what's going on in the background. Now, a lot of these things that I showed you today are not really documented by Tableau. There's no 5-minute video about data densification, and it's a really hard, nuanced thing that it would take hours to go through all the variations and ways to turn it on and off, and I just showed a couple of them here today.
Right.
Okay, so hopefully we'll do this again sometime, Matt.
Yeah, we can definitely expand on this, maybe add more dimensions to this problem and see what happens. But again, thank you so much, Joe, for your time.
Yeah, and if anybody has any feedback, you can find my email on the profile, or I would say don't comment on this thread with your feedback, but send it separately as an email, and we'll get back to you if you have any questions. Or
Absolutely.
If you have a recommendation on which question should Matt and I make a video about next, let us know via email.
Sure. Yep. I think my email is in my profile on the forums as well.
Perfect. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Joe.